Hey guys, tonight we slip gently into the still waters of ancient Mexico, where gardens float like quiet green carpets upon a lake. Picture yourself drifting in a canoe at dawn, cool mist curling over the surface, your paddle dipping silently as the first golden light spreads across the Valley of Mexico. In the middle of that vast basin sits the shimmering expanse of Lake Texcoco, and upon it, thousands of human-made rafts, plots of soil and reeds that somehow feed an empire. You probably won't survive this lifestyle if dropped here suddenly, unless you're particularly good at hauling mud all day while balancing on a wobbly platform, but that's exactly the sort of thing people did for centuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it as you listen? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean forward as the canoe glides closer. The floating gardens, Chinampas, the Aztecs called them, are not quite islands, not quite rafts, but something in between. Farmers marked out rectangles in the shallow parts of the lake, drove wooden stakes into the bottom, and then wove reed fences that looked a little like giant picnic baskets laid flat. Into these enclosures they pile layer upon layer of lake mud, rotting vegetation and silt until the surface rose above the water. Over years, the weight pressed down, compacting into solid land. It is one of the most sustainable farming systems ever devised. A mainstream fact historians never tire of. These chinampas could be astonishingly productive, up to 7 harvests a year of maize, beans, chili peppers, and squash. No wonder they call them the floating gardens that fed Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. You might think of them as early hydroponics minus the LED grow lights. The quirky tidbit: farmers often anchored young willow trees at the corners of each chinampa. These willows grew tall, their roots strengthening the edges like living rebar, and their leafy shade providing a place to nap when the midday sun made everyone feel like boiled corn. Imagine leaning back under the rustling branches, mud still caked on your shins, watching dragonflies skim the water. Not exactly glamorous, but certainly restful. Historians still argue whether chinampas were an Aztec invention or whether earlier peoples, perhaps the Xochimilca, developed them first, centuries before the empire rose. It seems likely the Aztecs inherited the idea, polished it, and then scaled it until it became the beating green heart of their economy. And yet, debates continue because archaeology here is as muddy as the lake bed itself. You feel the rhythm of the paddle strokes now. The canoe slides beside a chinampa where maize stalks rise taller than a man. Between the rows, bean vines climb like hopeful hitchhikers, while squash spreads its broad leaves low across the soil. Together they make a Three Sisters Guild, an arrangement that nourishes both crops and soil. In modern gardening circles, people call it companion planting. Back then they just called it food. The smell of damp earth drifts over you. Somewhere, a heron flaps up with a startled croak. You chuckle softly, because that bird has probably been startled by the same farmer's footsteps every day for years. These waters are thick with life. Fish flashing in the shallows, turtles plopping off logs, and yes, the occasional alligator floating by like a scaled log with teeth. You're glad your canoe feels steady, though you can't help but think, what if the alligator decides maize isn't enough fiber for today? Another fact to let you settle deeper: the system of chinampas covered tens of thousands of acres, making the lake into a checkerboard of green and silver. From above, it must have looked like a vast quilt stitched by patient hands, and those hands kept stitching season after season, ensuring not only survival but surplus. Tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan in the form of maize, chili peppers, and flowers, all thanks to these rectangles of mud and reeds. As you close your eyes, imagine yourself stepping from the canoe onto a chinampa. The soil feels springy, almost like stepping onto a sponge. A farmer hands you a wooden digging stick and gestures toward a row of seedlings. You bend down, press a hole into the damp soil, drop a kernel of maize inside, and cover it gently. The work is repetitive, but in that repetition, strangely calming. Maybe you even begin to see why these gardens work so well, not just as food factories, but as spaces where humans found rhythm in mud and water, sun and willow shade. And so tonight, you float there in your imagination. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico, at the moment when gardens are not simply on the land, but woven into the lake itself. The city in the distance glitters with temple fires, but here, on the quiet Chinampa, you hear only the lapping of water, the rustle of reeds, and the heartbeat of an empire taking root in floating soil. The mist drapes itself across Lake Texcoco like a giant veil, softening the jagged ridges of the surrounding mountains. You're out in a canoe, your paddle barely disturbing the surface, and the air tastes faintly of salt. That's the first surprise. You wouldn't expect a lake in the middle of a valley to be brackish, but Texcoco was partly saline, the product of runoff trapped without a true outlet. The Aztecs, clever as ever, learned to live with it, even thrive in it, though the water could sting your lips if you scooped it up for a drink, not exactly Evian. At dawn, the lake is the place of hushed energy. Fishermen squat in their dugouts, lowering nets, hoping for a silver haul of whitefish or axolotls, the odd, frilly-gilled salamanders that seem like they escaped from a fantasy novel. The Chinampas lie in orderly rows, their rectangular outlines forming watery streets. Farmers maneuver their canoes between these lanes, calling out greetings, voices muffled by the mist. Some balance baskets of vegetables at the prow, bound for the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan. Others carry bundles of reeds or sacks of fresh mud to repair the banks. One mainstream fact you settle into, this lake basin was actually a mosaic of 5 interconnected lakes, Texcoco being the largest. Each had its own character, some fresher, some saltier. To manage them, the Aztecs engineered dikes and causeways, part of a sophisticated hydraulic system that kept water levels balanced. Their most famous was the dike of Nezahualcoyotl, which separated fresh and brackish water. Historians still marvel at its scale, nearly 10 miles long, built centuries before Europeans introduced the word civil engineering to the Americas. The quirky tidbit, axolotls weren't just caught for food. Some people kept them in little reed baskets submerged at the edge of Chinampas, almost like pets, though pet might be generous when you eventually end up in someone's stew. Still, you imagine a farmer's child dangling their fingers in the water, giggling as the slippery creature brushed past. Axolotls even fascinated Aztec priests, who saw them as sacred manifestations of the god Xolotl, the trickster who supposedly turned himself into a salamander to avoid sacrifice. Nice try, Xolotl, didn't quite work out. Historians still argue whether the dawn routines you're witnessing were strictly regimented or more relaxed. Some sources suggest labor quotas were enforced, farmers required to deliver specific amounts of produce to the empire. Others propose that daily life on the Chinampas allowed more autonomy, families deciding when to fish, when to plant, when to paddle into town. The truth likely lies somewhere between discipline and freedom, as it usually does. You lean back in your canoe, listening. Somewhere, a conch shell trumpet blares faintly across the water, calling people toward the temples. The sound mingles with the cries of water birds, making it hard to tell what's human and what's wild. A heron lifts itself from the reeds, its wings beating in slow, powerful strokes, leaving ripples that spread until they meet the reflection of the city in the distance. That city, Tenochtitlan, rises from the lake like a dream, its white stucco walls and temple pyramids glowing pink in the sunrise. You see causeways stretching like ribbons toward the mainland, and between them, the surface glittering with traffic, hundreds of canoes slipping in, out, and across. If you squint, the whole scene feels like Venice on steroids, except instead of gondolas, you have mud-streaked farmers and cargoes of chili peppers. Not quite as romantic, but far more practical. The water laps gently at the sides of your canoe. You notice the faint smell of smoke drifting from cooking fires. Breakfast is underway in little huts on the Chinampas, griddles heating, maize tortillas puffing. A farmer waves, tossing you a tamale wrapped in corn husk. You bite into it, steam rising, filled with beans spiced by chili. The flavor is earthy, grounding. A reminder that these floating rectangles weren't just farms, but living spaces, complete microcosms of Aztec society. And so you glide forward deeper into the waking day, mist thins, sunlight brightens, and the lake reveals itself as a humming, interconnected system of food, trade, ritual, and family life. It is both natural and artificial, wilderness and cityscape. For now, you rest easy, knowing you are drifting across one of the great engineering marvels of human history, a place where earth floats, where cities shine on water, and where even the salamanders carry myths on their backs. You steady your canoe against a row of reeds and watch as a group of farmers begins the careful work of building a new chinampa. It's like a slow-motion magic trick, transforming water into land. The first step is staking out a rectangle in the shallow lake, usually about 30 feet wide and maybe 100 feet long, although some stretched even larger. Men drive sharpened poles of a huejote willow deep into the lake bed, marking the corners. They lash horizontal reeds between the poles, forming a fence that holds in whatever gets dumped inside. At first it looks unimpressive, just a watery frame bobbing in the shallows. But then the work begins. Canoes arrive laden with black muck dredged from the lake bottom. That mud, rich with nutrients, is shoveled over the side. Rotting vegetation, twigs, and reeds follow, back and forth, trip after trip, mud piles higher, the rectangle slowly filling like a casserole dish layered with lake goo. The smell? Imagine damp compost mixed with swamp, which is exactly what it is. You wrinkle your nose, but you admit it's fertile stuff. One mainstream fact, this layering technique recycled nutrients in a way modern agriculture still struggles to match. Sediment from canals was constantly replenished, keeping the soil incredibly productive. Crops rotated with little need for fallow time. The Aztecs essentially hacked the problem of soil exhaustion centuries before industrial fertilizers existed. The quirky tidbit? Builders sometimes deliberately added fish bones, shells, or even kitchen scraps into the muck as extra enrichment. One friar who saw it after the Spanish conquest remarked that the plots smelled like a stew pot gone mad. You chuckle. He clearly didn't appreciate the art of composting. Today, gardeners would nod approvingly and say, yes, that's premium organic matter. Historians still argue whether the first chinampas were temporary, rafts that drifted free until anchored, or if they were always permanent constructions tied into the lake bottom. Some evidence suggests both existed at different times, with mobile gardens floating about like oversized lily pads before families decided to fix them in place. The debate continues, because no one left behind a handy DIY chinampa construction manual for us to reference. You imagine yourself hauling up mud in a woven basket. Each scoop drips through your fingers, heavy and cool. You toss it into the frame, hear the satisfying plop, and watch the waterline rise inch by inch. It's repetitive work, but strangely soothing. Even the splash of the paddle as more canoes arrive with fresh loads feels like part of a rhythm. A heartbeat of construction. As the mound grows solid, willow saplings are planted at the corners. Over time, their roots knit into the structure, preventing erosion, and their trunks provide anchor points for tying canoes. These living posts give chinampas their iconic look, rectangles of green framed by willows swaying gently above the water. You stretch out your arms beneath the shade, realizing how clever it is to build not only land, but landscape. A farmer squats beside you, his face streaked with mud, and pats the ground proudly. He says nothing, but his grin tells you this patch of muck will soon feed a family, then a market, then perhaps even the emperor's table. You nod, respecting the quiet genius of transforming lake into breadbasket. When you glance up again, you notice the quilt of chinampas spreading farther than you can see, each rectangle stitched neatly to the next by narrow canals. Canoes slip through these watery corridors like ants in a hive. The city gleams faintly on the horizon, but here, the work is humble, gritty, and grounded, literally building life out of mud. The sun climbs higher, and already you see the first maize seedlings pushed into the damp soil. They stand like tiny soldiers, promising rows of green to come. You lean back, squelching mud between your toes, and smile. It may smell swampy, but this is the smell of empire. An empire quite literally rooted in muck. The sun edges higher over the Valley of Mexico, and with it the chinampas begin to stir into their daytime rhythm. You find yourself walking, while wobbling, down one of the narrow earthen rows, trying not to topple into the canal. The soil feels springy under your feet, damp from yesterday's irrigation. Ahead, farmers kneel with wooden digging sticks, carefully planting maize kernels in neat rows. The rhythm of the stick punching the soil, the seed dropping in, the soil being pressed closed again. It's almost musical, a steady percussion of food being promised. Here you encounter one of the most brilliant ideas of chinampa farming, planting cycles. Farmers here don't just plant maize alone. They weave beans around the stalks, letting the vines climb up like green hitchhikers, and squash sprawls across the ground, shading the soil with its broad leaves. Together, maize, beans, and squash form the famous Three Sisters. Maize provides structure, beans fix nitrogen into the soil, and squash keeps moisture in and weeds out. It's like watching a plant symphony play itself, each part strengthening the others. One mainstream fact worth resting on: these polyculture systems allowed Chinampa farmers to harvest up to 7 times a year. Imagine that, 7 harvests when most medieval Europeans were lucky to get 1 or 2. No wonder Tenochtitlan could feed hundreds of thousands of mouths daily and still have extra for tribute and trade. A quirky tidbit slides in with a smile. Chinampa farmers sometimes sprinkled chili powder directly onto crops, not as seasoning, but as a natural pesticide. You picture a duck sneezing violently after trying to nibble beans, flapping away in indignant defeat. Effective and a little comical. If modern farmers had thought of it, we'd probably see bags of organic chili dust pest repellent lining the shelves of garden centers. Historians still argue whether farmers adhered to strict imperial calendars for planting or simply followed the cues of the seasons and the lake. Some evidence suggests priestly calendars dictated planting days tied to rituals, while others believe farmers exercised their own judgment, watching rainfall, wind, and bird migrations. Perhaps both were true. Cosmic order overlaid on practical farming. It's one of those questions where the scholarly debates sprout as thickly as the maize itself. You crouch now, running your hands through the dark soil. It crumbles between your fingers, moist but not waterlogged, perfect for germination. Tiny sprouts already push upward, fragile green arrows breaking the surface. Farmers walk lightly between the rows, careful not to crush them. A boy toddles after his father, dragging a miniature digging stick, more toy than tool, but already learning the steps. Farming here isn't just livelihood, it's inheritance. Overhead, birds wheel lazily. A heron lands on the edge of a chinampa and snatches a fish with surgical precision. You blink, thinking how these little islands aren't isolated. They're ecosystems, merging human order with wild rhythm. The maize drinks the sun, the beans cling upward, the squash sprawls in lazy loops, and everything hums together. You settle back against a willow trunk, listening to the gentle clink of wooden hose, the occasional splash of a fish, and the faint calls of traders paddling by. If you close your eyes, you could almost be at a modern farmer's market, except here, the market comes to the city in thousands of canoes, each loaded with these very vegetables. The planting continues, the chinampas breathing in the sun, breathing out food, and you, perched at the edge, realize you've been pulled into their rhythm, quiet, steady, endlessly fertile. You smile at the thought, an empire fed not by grand palaces or armies, but by beans twisting around maize stalks and squash curling like sleepy cats across the ground. By mid-morning, the lake breeze carries a fragrance that surprises you. Not just the earthy scent of damp soil or the smoky tang of cooking fires, but something sweeter, brighter. You follow your nose and discover an entire chinampa devoted not to maize or beans, but to flowers. Rows upon rows of marigolds, dahlias, and fragrant herbs sway in the sunlight, their colors blazing against the blue of the canals. This is no accident. Flowers were as much a part of Aztec life as tortillas and chili peppers. You might imagine that in a city of 200,000 people, every inch of soil should go to food. Yet here, farmers cultivate blooms destined for temples, festivals, and markets. Marigolds especially were sacred, their golden petals sprinkled onto altars during ceremonies to honor the gods. You can almost picture priests stepping carefully into the temple precincts, hands cupped around baskets of blossoms, their fragrance lifting like incense. One mainstream fact, the Aztecs grew not only marigolds, but also Quetzalcoatl, the 20 flower, whose bright heads you might recognize today on Dia de los Muertos altars. That tradition, remarkably, is a direct thread linking modern Mexico to these floating gardens centuries ago. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. Some chinampas specialized in growing flowers purely to perfume the bustling marketplaces of Tenochtitlan. Merchants sprinkled petals on the ground to keep dust down and to make stalls more pleasant for customers. Imagine walking into a Walmart today and finding rose petals scattered along the aisles. Suddenly, grocery shopping feels more like a wedding. Historians still argue whether flower cultivation here was primarily an elite indulgence or widespread practice. Some sources suggest only noble families and priests demanded daily supplies of blossoms, while others believe ordinary households also cherished them, using flowers to mark everything from weddings to funerals. The evidence leans both ways, as colorful and tangled as the flower beds themselves. You kneel down beside a bed of dahlias, running your hand lightly along their soft petals. The colors seem almost exaggerated in the sun, deep reds, fiery oranges, bright yellows. Bees buzz lazily from one bloom to another, carrying out their ancient task of pollination. In this moment, you realize that Chinampas were more than factories of calories. They were laboratories of beauty. A farmer cuts a bundle of blossoms, ties them with a reed cord, and loads them into a canoe. You imagine his path, paddling quietly into the heart of the city where buyers await. Some flowers will be woven into garlands, others laid upon the bodies of sacrificial victims, still others ground into cosmetics or infused into drinks. The line between sacred and mundane blurs here. Flowers brighten a lover's hair just as they sanctify a god's altar. You pause to take in the sensory mix, the sharp spice of chili drying on one chinampa, the lush sweetness of flowers on another, the faint salt tang of the lake all around. It's a reminder that this empire balanced survival and ceremony side by side. Food for the body, fragrance for the soul. A small child toddles past, clutching a single marigold like its treasure. He thrusts it at you proudly, his face smeared with mud. You laugh softly, tuck the flower behind your ear, and realize you've become part of this odd choreography. Canoes gliding, blossoms swaying, mud clinging, life flowing. And so you continue drifting along the canals, watching the flower gardens of Tenochtitlan shimmer in the sun. They whisper something subtle, that even empires need beauty as much as bread. The sun has burned away the last of the morning mist, and now the Chinampas hum with steady labor. You hitch a ride in a narrow canoe, its wooden frame creaking softly as a farmer paddles. The boat is piled high with baskets, squash, beans, herbs, and bright bundles of flowers tied neatly with reed cords. The farmer's young daughter sits at the front, balancing a basket nearly as big as she is, the edges bristling with green onions. The canoe rocks gently, but she looks unconcerned, clearly used to this daily commute. You notice how easily the farmer steers with a single paddle, dipping it rhythmically into the canal. The water's shallow, glassy, and reflects rows of willows overhead. Passing canoes nod in quiet recognition. This is rush hour, Chinampa style. Yet there are no wheels, no clattering hooves, no shouting drivers, just the swish of paddles and the faint splash of fish startled beneath. One mainstream fact, these produced canoes fueled the enormous market at Tlatelolco, the twin city to Tenochtitlan. Spanish chroniclers, still giddy with amazement, claimed over 60,000 people crowded there on busy days. For comparison, that was more than most European cities could manage at the time. The Chinampa farmers were the silent engine behind this spectacle, their canoes like veins carrying food into the beating heart of the empire. The quirky tidbit: some families grew so adept at packing canoes that they developed signature stacking styles. One conquistador noted he could recognize villages by how the produce was arranged: flowers upright in bundles, chilies heaped into pyramids, maize stacked like golden bricks. It's a bit like recognizing your favorite food truck today by the quirky paint job. Historians still argue whether these farmers were paid fair prices in the market or forced to deliver quotas as tribute. Some accounts suggest lively bargaining and competition, while others emphasize state control, with officials recording amounts due. Either way, the sight of hundreds of canoes arriving each dawn remains an image of abundance, whether voluntary or demanded. You lean forward as the canoe glides into a wider canal. The air grows busier, children splashing at the banks, fishermen selling the morning's catch, dogs barking from the narrow strips of land. It's a world both watery and earthy, where everyone seems perfectly balanced between the two. The farmer offers you a tortilla, warm from the morning griddle, topped with fresh beans and a crumble of white cheese. You bite in and the flavor is simple yet perfect, the kind of fuel that keeps paddles dipping for hours. Around you, the city begins to swell into view, towering temples, white stucco walls, and causeways lined with people. As you approach the bustle of Tenochtitlan, you marvel at the silence of the journey. No traffic jams, no horns, just steady paddling, gliding through a watery highway designed centuries before anyone spoke of urban planning. You realize this commute is not a chore but a ritual, a daily blending of land and water, work and city. You recline against the canoe's edge, feeling the gentle sway, and allow yourself to drift. The city draws closer. The market awaits, and the gardens of the lake continue feeding an empire, one basket, one paddle stroke at a time. By the time you drift into the shadow of Tenochtitlan's towering temples, the city feels alive with hunger. Canoes bump gently against one another along the docks, each piled high with produce from the Chinampas. You climb out, steadying yourself on slick wooden planks, and find yourself surrounded by baskets of maize, heaps of squash, piles of chilies, and fragrant bundles of herbs. The air is thick with smells, earthy, spicy, faintly fishy, an olfactory chorus announcing that breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 250,000 people has just arrived. One mainstream fact: Tenochtitlan's population may have reached 200,000 at its peak, making it one of the largest cities on Earth in the early 16th century. London, at the same time, barely half that size. And unlike London, where the stench of sewage could peel the paint off a wall, here the city glimmered, its streets washed daily, its markets bursting with food brought by canoe. The empire's appetite was enormous, and the Chinampas kept it satisfied. You stand in awe as baskets are unloaded in a steady stream. A farmer with a back strong as a cedar tree shoulders a sack of beans. A boy staggers under the weight of chili peppers, sneezing violently every few steps. A woman carefully arranges flowers in a clay pot, their scent wafting above the din. Everyone plays a role in feeding the city, from toddlers carrying handfuls of herbs to gray-haired grandmothers balancing baskets like seasoned acrobats. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists believe Chinampas didn't just feed people, they fattened up the emperor's exotic animals too. Montezuma's private menagerie, which astonished the Spaniards, included jaguars, eagles, and even snakes, all fed with a steady supply of fish and vegetables. Picture yourself lugging a basket of squash only to be told, "Oh good, the emperor's pet jaguar loves those." Comforting thought. Historians still argue whether Chinampas were the backbone of the empire's food supply or just one part of a more complex system. Some insist the floating gardens alone sustained the city's masses. Others argue maize from surrounding highlands and tribute from conquered provinces were equally crucial. The truth, as usual, is tangled. Empire-sized appetites rarely rest on just one source. You weave your way into the crowd and feel the energy of distribution. Canoes arrive, unload, and turn back toward the lake for another round. Porters hustle the goods into the labyrinthine streets. Market criers shout prices, competing with the chatter of bargaining. It is both chaos and order, somehow working together like gears in a massive machine. As you stand at the edge of the market, you can't help but think about the fragility of it all. The city's survival depends on these daily deliveries. A disruption, flood, drought, or war would ripple through the empire like a cracked paddle through water. And yet, for now, the system hums smoothly, the appetite of the city matched by the abundance of the Chinampas. You take a deep breath, filling your lungs with a heady mixture of maize dust, chili sting, and flower perfume. This is the scent of empire, not incense in temples or blood in battlefields, but food arriving on time every day from the lake. As the bustle of the market fades behind you, you slip back into a canoe and glide toward quieter canals. Here, the work feels less about commerce and more about ritual. A small group of farmers gathers at the edge of a chinampa, their faces solemn, baskets of maize meal and flowers at their feet. You pause, watching as they kneel by the water, sprinkle maize into the canal, and murmur words you can't quite catch. The petals drift across the ripples like tiny suns, soft and bright. One mainstream fact grounds this scene. Agriculture in Aztec society wasn't just practical labor, it was sacred duty. Maize wasn't merely a crop, it was life itself. Humans were thought to be fashioned from maize dough in the myths of creation. To plant maize was to participate in renewing the world. Every handful of seeds carried cosmic weight. The quirky tidbit that makes you smile. Sometimes offerings to the lake included tiny figurines made of amaranth dough shaped like people or animals. Children might help mold them, pressing their small fingers into the sticky mixture. The figurines were then cast into the water as gifts to the gods. Imagine Play-Doh, but holy, and with a one-way trip to the bottom of the canal. Historians still argue whether these rituals were private acts of family devotion or part of larger state-directed ceremonies. Some records describe farmers praying quietly before planting, while others describe mass offerings coordinated by priests. Perhaps it was both, a spectrum from the intimate to the imperial, each act reinforcing the same idea that humans owed the gods gratitude for every ear of corn that sprouted. The farmers finish their offering. One dips a reed broom into the canal and splashes water gently across the soil as though baptizing the field. Another sets a marigold bloom at the base of a young maize stalk. You feel a hush settle over the chinampa, broken only by the call of a passing bird. The air grows warmer as the sun climbs, but for a moment you sense the cool thread of continuity: mud, seed, prayer, harvest, repeat. It's a cycle as steady as the paddle strokes that keep the canoes moving, as endless as the ripples spreading out from the falling petals. You lean back against the side of the canoe, letting your hand trail through the water, and wonder, do the gods notice? Do they feel honored by the maize meal drifting like pale clouds beneath the surface? Or do they simply enjoy that humans keep trying century after century to say thank you in the language of flowers and food? Either way, the ritual lingers in your mind, weaving itself into the story of these floating gardens. The day stretches on, and now dusk settles gently across the valley. Shadows lengthen, the air cools, and the Chinampas take on a different personality. You linger with a small family who has decided to stay the night on their plot. They've built a humble hut of reeds and thatch perched on the narrow strip of soil. Smoke curls lazily from a cooking fire as the mother stirs a pot, the aroma of beans and chili drifting warmly into the evening air. The water mirrors the sky, turning from blue to violet, then to ink black. A canoe glides silently past, its paddle strokes muffled in the gathering dark. Fireflies begin to twinkle above the canals, a scatter of living stars that echo the constellations slowly emerging overhead. The Chinampa feels like its own little world, suspended between water and sky. One mainstream fact: Chinampa farmers often live part-time on their plots, especially during planting and harvesting seasons. While many return to the main city each night, some families maintained huts right on the gardens, creating miniature floating homesteads. These huts were practical: shelter for tools, storage for harvest, and a place to rest when dawn's work loomed close. The quirky tidbit: some accounts mention farmers scaring away owls at night, not because the birds threatened crops, but because their eerie calls were thought to be omens. Imagine trying to sleep after a long day of hauling mud, only to have an owl hooting doom over your shoulder. You'd probably fling a chili pepper at it too. Historians still argue whether nights on the Chinampas were primarily peaceful or perilous. Some describe tranquil evenings filled with the sound of crickets and frogs, while others warn of dangers: bandits lurking in canoes or even jaguars slipping down from the surrounding hills. The evidence is patchy, and like many aspects of daily Aztec life, the truth likely contained both serenity and risk. You curl up near the fire, listening as the family hums a simple tune. The father patches a basket with fresh reeds, his hands moving automatically, weaving strength back into the worn frame. The mother ladles out bowls of steaming stew. The children giggle, chasing one another in the dim glow, their feet splashing in the canal's edge before being shooed back toward the hut. Overhead, the moon rises full and luminous, painting the water silver. The Chinampas stretch into the distance, each one a dark rectangle fringed with trees, their reflections doubling the world. You feel the cool dampness of the soil beneath you, smell the mingled scents of earth and smoke, and hear the gentle slap of water against the banks. As you let your eyes drift closed, you realize this too was part of the empire's rhythm, not just the bustle of markets or the clamor of rituals, but quiet nights on floating fields where families found rest under the watch of owls and stars. Morning breaks again, and with it comes the rattle and scrape of tools. You stretch your arms, blinking at the light, and watch farmers ready their equipment for another day. No bronze plows, no iron shovels, just humble wooden sticks, reed baskets, and clever hands. The primary tool here is the sioo, a pointed digging stick sharpened and hardened by fire. It looks deceptively simple, but in the right hands it slices into soil, plants maize, and loosens roots with ease. You give it a try, wobbling a bit, and nearly topple into the canal. The farmer chuckles politely, which is generous given your performance. One mainstream fact: Chinampa agriculture never relied on draft animals or metal tools. Oxen and horses didn't exist here until the Spanish arrived, and yet the productivity of these floating fields astonished Europeans. The secret wasn't brute force, but technique, knowing how to work with mud, water, and plants in harmony. The quirky tidbit. Farmers sometimes use long-handled scoops shaped like oversized spoons to dredge nutrient-rich muck from the canals. Kids loved this chore because the muck often contained wriggling fish or tadpoles, bonus snacks if you weren't squeamish. Imagine scooping out mud for fertilizer and finding dinner swimming in it. It's farm to table with a side of slime. Historians still argue whether Chinampa productivity was due mostly to these tools and techniques or to the sheer dedication of the farmers. Was it the design of the system or the endless human labor poured into it that kept the city fed? The answer, as usual, lies somewhere in the muddy middle. You watch as baskets woven from reeds are filled with squash and chilies, the weave tight and sturdy enough to last through countless trips. Another farmer smooths the chinampa's edge with his hands, pressing reeds and mud together like a baker sealing dough. Everywhere you look, the tools are extensions of human ingenuity. Simple, yes, but effective. The air is alive with sound, the rhythmic thunk of digging sticks, the splash of muck scoops, the rustle of reeds being cut for repairs. It's almost meditative, a chorus of humble instruments playing the same song day after day, season after season. You begin to understand that here, farming wasn't about innovation for its own sake, but refinement. Each stick, scoop, and basket was honed by generations until it worked seamlessly with the Chinampa system. You trail your fingers over the handle of a koa, smooth from years of use, and wonder how many hands before yours have gripped it. How many bushels of maize did it help plant? How many harvests did it guarantee? The tool is modest, but in it rests the quiet power of an empire fed not by steel, but by sticks and mud. As the sun climbs higher, you lean back in the canoe and let the rhythm of work wash over you. Simple tools, simple motions, and yet the result, an entire city thriving on floating gardens, is anything but simple. The sun sits high, and the chinampas shimmer with heat. You squint toward the horizon and notice that these floating plots aren't alone. Strange neighbors wander, swim, and flap through the canals, ignoring the humans busily hoeing and hauling. A heron stands motionless in the shallows, its reflection as sharp as its beak, waiting for the flick of a fish. Nearby, a turtle suns itself on a half-submerged log, legs sprawled like a lazy dog. The Chinampa is alive not just with crops, but with creatures. One mainstream fact, the Valley of Mexico's wetlands were among the most biodiverse ecosystems in pre-Columbian North America. Chinampas didn't destroy this richness, they enhanced it, creating a patchwork of habitats where wild and cultivated life coexisted. Farmers drew fish from the canals, harvested waterfowl, and hunted frogs, all while tending their maize and beans. Food security here meant more than just corn tortillas. The quirky tidbit, conquistadors once reported seeing alligators in the lake, though most scholars think they actually saw caimans brought as tribute or perhaps misidentified large salamanders. Imagine paddling your canoe, arms full of chili peppers, and spotting what looks like a floating log with teeth drifting your way. Not exactly the serene commute you'd prefer. Historians still argue whether these canals were managed primarily for farming or also for aquaculture. Some suggest fish were deliberately encouraged, their waste fertilizing the water, and their bodies enriching the diet. Others insist fishing was incidental, a pleasant bonus to the main business of growing crops. The debate drifts on like the herons overhead. You tilt your head back and catch sight of an osprey circling, scanning for prey. Its cry cuts the still air, and then splash, it dives, vanishing into the water and re-emerging with a struggling fish. The farmer beside you barely glances up, too busy weeding a row of beans. For him, such spectacles are daily background noise, as common as the rustle of squash leaves. You lean closer to the canal and watch tiny axolotls wriggling like odd, frilly-limbed ghosts. Their gills fan out in delicate pink branches, their black eyes unblinking. Children crouch at the edge, giggling as they scoop them into baskets, careful not to spill them back. Tonight some will end up roasted, others stewed with herbs. Still others will be set aside for ritual offerings. The lake provides in endless, unexpected ways. A splash startles you. 2 ducks crash land into the beans, flapping wildly as they peck at the tender leaves. A farmer shouts, waving his arms, while his son tosses handfuls of chili dust to scare them off. The ducks retreat indignantly, quacking as though they were the victims of injustice. You grin, realizing that farm pests, no matter the century, always believe the field belongs to them. As evening cools the air, you listen to the chorus of frogs, birds, and insects blending into a natural symphony. The Chinampas may look like orderly rectangles from above, but down here, they're vibrant crossroads where humans and animals jostle for space. You close your eyes for a moment, hearing the wings, splashes, and croaks around you, and think, these gardens never floated alone. They floated with neighbors. The days on the Chinampas move in rhythms as steady as your own breathing. You begin to notice how the farmers' lives bend to the seasons, each stage of the year bringing its own tasks, its own pace. The Valley of Mexico doesn't have the four neat seasons you might expect. Instead, it pulses between rainy months and dry months, the lake swelling and shrinking like a living lung. One mainstream fact: planting usually began with the rains in late spring. Farmers pushed maize kernels into the damp soil as storms rolled in, the thunder sounding almost like ceremonial drums. By midsummer, green stalks rose shoulder high, and beans twined up their sides while squash sprawled luxuriously at their feet. Come autumn, harvests were hauled in by canoe, baskets stacked precariously high. And then, without much pause, the cycle started again, the Chinampas producing multiple crops a year thanks to their fertile mud and constant irrigation. A quirky tidbit makes you smile. Farmers often used floating calendars, literally painted wooden boards, to mark seasonal changes. They'd float them near their huts, not for show, but as reminders of planting days, festivals, and even when to dredge the canals. Imagine checking your wall calendar only to realize it's bobbing gently beside your canoe. Oh look, time to weed the squash again. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs followed rigid agricultural calendars dictated by priests or whether families simply trusted their own observations. Some chronicles describe rituals tied to precise dates in the sacred calendar, while others hint at farmers watching the skies, the birds, and the color of the lake water to decide. Maybe both were true. Cosmic order layered onto everyday practicality. You paddle through a canal where farmers are knee-deep in mud, dredging silt to enrich their plots. The smell is ripe, but they laugh as they work, tossing jokes as easily as they toss mud. A boy carries seedlings from a nursery bed, his small arms full of delicate green shoots. His grandmother instructs him sternly, pointing to where they should go. Farming here isn't bound by clocks, it's bound by cycles, by a choreography as old as the lake itself. As the day fades, you sense the shift in energy. The air cools, willows cast long shadows, and families pause to share tamales wrapped in husks. The work never truly ends, but it slows, stretching into quiet evenings when the stars take over the calendar. You lean back in your canoe, rock gently by the water, and realize that here life isn't divided into weeks or months. It's measured in rains, harvests, and the soft rhythm of paddles dipping into the canals. The sun rises again, and you watch as farmers move through the fields with a different kind of focus. Today, it isn't planting or harvesting, it's pest control. Even the most fertile Chinampa, with its rich mud and clever crop cycles, faces uninvited guests. Ducks swoop down and gobble beans, insects munch holes through maize leaves, and opportunistic neighbors, the feathered and the furry kind, eye the squash like it's an open buffet. One mainstream fact: the Aztecs managed pests mostly without chemicals. They relied on vigilance, clever deterrence, and the balance of nature itself. Ducks were driven off with shouts and thrown clods of mud. Insects were picked off by hand or discouraged with plant companions like marigolds whose strong scent confused them. These were low-tech solutions, but remarkably effective. And here comes the quirky tidbit: chili powder wasn't just for seasoning stews. Farmers sprinkled it around plants to repel pests. You imagine a duck waddling in confidently, pecking at a bean sprout, only to sneeze so hard it stumbles back into the canal. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer probably chuckles, "That'll teach you, Senor Pato." Historians still argue whether the Aztecs intentionally encouraged insect-eating birds and amphibians to linger near the Chinampas, or if this was just a happy accident of the wetland ecosystem. Some evidence suggests farmers tolerated herons and frogs because they devoured pests. Others believe they were too focused on their crops to think about ecological balance, and the truth likely straddles both sides, part intention, part serendipity. You lean closer to the maize stalks and notice tiny ants marching in disciplined lines. A farmer crouches, follows the line to a mound, and pours water over it, scattering the colony. Meanwhile, children run along the banks, clapping their hands to scare off birds, their laughter mixing with the squawks of offended ducks. Pest control doubles as playtime. The smell of crushed marigold leaves fills the air as women scatter them between squash rows, creating a fragrant barrier. It's practical, but also strangely soothing, like a field perfumed on purpose. You rub a leaf between your fingers and bring it to your nose. Sharp, almost citrusy, oddly pleasant. You sit back and realize that pest control here isn't a battle so much as a negotiation. Humans make it slightly inconvenient for pests. Pests adapt. Humans adjust again. Back and forth like a slow game of strategy across the seasons. And in the middle of it all, the Chinampas endure, feeding both people and occasionally a very confused duck. The next morning, your canoe glides toward the great market of Tlatelolco, where the hum of trade rises like the buzz of a beehive. Long before you even arrive, the sound carries across the lake. Shouts, laughter, the steady splash of paddles. Farmers steer their canoes into the wide landing zone, and you join them, basket-laden boats jostling for space like a floating parking lot. Stepping onto the stone causeway, you are swept into a tide of humanity. The market is enormous, stretching farther than you can easily see. Canopies of woven mats flap in the breeze, shading stalls piled with produce from the Chinampas. Maize gleams golden in neat stacks. Chilies glow like embers. Herbs spill from baskets in fragrant tangles. And then flowers everywhere, their colors almost dizzying after the green uniformity of the fields. One mainstream fact: Spanish chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo described Tlatelolco's market as larger and more organized than anything they had seen in Europe. Estimates suggest as many as 60,000 people might gather here on peak days. For context, that was larger than most European cities' entire populations. It wasn't just a market, it was an empire's pantry and department store rolled into one. The quirky tidbit: the market even had designated smell police. Certain officials walked around with bunches of flowers, making sure vendors didn't reek too strongly of fish or garlic. If things got too pungent, they'd wave blossoms in front of their noses or scold merchants. Imagine getting fined today for bad booth hygiene at your local farmer's market. Historians still argue whether Tlatelolco was mainly a free-for-all bazaar or if imperial officials strictly controlled prices and supply. Some evidence suggests lively bartering, others hint at rigid oversight with scribes tallying tribute. Perhaps both existed simultaneously, free market chaos carefully framed by imperial bookkeeping. You shuffle along, hypnotized by the variety. There are piles of tomatoes, baskets of beans, stalks of amaranth, and gourds carved into containers. You spot cages of turkeys, their feathers ruffled, and even a stall offering roasted insects, crunchy snacks for the adventurous. The air is thick with smells: roasted maize, fresh herbs, fish drying in the sun, and flowers perfuming it all. A vendor calls to you, waving a tamale steaming in its husk. You take it, the masa warm in your hands, flavored with squash blossoms. Each bite is both hearty and delicate, as if the Chinampas themselves had been folded into the dough. Around you, bargaining continues, laughter, haggling, dramatic sighs when someone refuses a price. You wander deeper past rows of spices, feathers, obsidian blades, and cotton cloth, yet even among these luxuries, the steady presence of Chinampa produce dominates. The empire's wealth and ritual grandeur still rest, at day's end, on baskets of beans, bundles of maize, and chili peppers carried in canoes from the lake. As the sun tilts westward, you stand at the heart of the market, listening to the vibrant murmur of trade. It feels like the empire itself is breathing here. Inhale food, exhale civilization. Without the floating gardens, this roar of voices would fall silent. You drift back out of the marketplace and into the quieter lanes of the Chinampas, where another kind of exchange is taking place, not with coins or cacao beans, but with inheritance and memory. You watch as an elderly farmer kneels at the edge of a plot, his grandson beside him. The old man presses his palm into the soil, then places the boy's hand directly on top of his, as if passing something invisible but essential. This isn't just land, it's legacy. One mainstream fact: Chinampas were recognized as property owned and passed down through families, much like farmland elsewhere in the world. Legal records from the Aztec period note disputes, inheritances, and sales, showing that these soggy rectangles of soil were considered valuable assets, not just temporary patches of mud. The quirky tidbit: families sometimes marked their Chinampas with small shrines or carved wooden figures to indicate ownership, essentially floating lawn ornaments. Some even planted a distinctive tree at the corner, like a natural family crest. Imagine saying, Ours is the plot with the funny-looking willow. Don't touch our squash. Historians still argue whether women could inherit Chinampas directly. Some records suggest widows controlled land and even managed planting, while others imply male relatives always stepped in. The scholarly debate continues, reflecting the broader question of women's economic power in Aztec society. As usual, the evidence is tangled, like bean vines around maize. You picture generations cycling through the same soil, grandparents planting the first willow stakes, parents dredging mud year after year, children learning to paddle straight lines between the plots. Each chinampa becomes a family diary written in maize rows instead of ink. Every corner willow, every woven reed bank whispers the touch of countless hands. A woman kneels beside her husband, scattering marigold petals along the bank. It's not for ritual sacrifice today, but simply to honor ancestors who once worked the same patch. The petals float golden against the water, as if saying, "We remember and we continue." You crouch, pressing your own hand into the soil. It's springy, warm, faintly damp. You feel how much it has absorbed. Centuries of mud, ash, compost, even memories. You realize these floating gardens aren't just engineering marvels or food machines. They're family heirlooms, drifting across time as steadily as they drift across the water. The boy beside the old farmer laughs as a frog leaps onto his knee, startling him. The grandfather chuckles, steadying the boy's hand again on the earth. You smile at the scene, thinking, this is how empires survive, not only through conquest and tribute, but through the quiet, stubborn passing down of mud, maize, and memory. The lake air feels heavier today, thick with the quiet presence of officials. As you paddle along the Chinampas, you notice men in cloaks, their canoes laden not with produce but with clay tablets and reed pens. They aren't here to plant or harvest, they're here to count. Tribute day has arrived. One mainstream fact: the Aztec Empire relied heavily on tribute from conquered peoples and from its own citizens. For Chinampa farmers, that meant surrendering a portion of their harvest to the state: maize, beans, chilies, flowers, even reeds. This system filled imperial storehouses and kept warriors, priests, and nobles well supplied. The quirky tidbit: tribute records mention not only food, but also seemingly odd demands: baskets of insects, bundles of herbs, even frogs. Some of these taxes were destined for medicine or ritual. Imagine having to explain to your neighbor, yes, the empire took my chilies and also a sack of grasshoppers. Don't ask. Historians still argue whether tribute from Chinampas was crushing or manageable. Some scholars believe the burden was so heavy that farmers lived under constant pressure. Others suggest tribute was balanced by the abundance of the fields. Painful, yes, but not ruinous. The truth likely shifted over time, depending on who ruled and how generous or greedy they were feeling. You watch as a farmer steps forward, offering baskets of maize to an official. The official marks symbols onto his clay tablet, nodding gravely. A second farmer presents bundles of flowers, their fragrance almost mocking the seriousness of the exchange. Children peek from behind reed huts, whispering nervously as the officials tally goods. The atmosphere is tense but not explosive. Everyone knows the system. Tribute keeps the empire strong, the temples resplendent, and the armies armed. Yet you sense the quiet frustration beneath it all. After all, no farmer beams with joy when half his beans disappear into an official's canoe. You lean against the side of your boat and watch the process repeat, canoe after canoe, plot after plot. The lake ripples softly under the weight of both food and obligation. For all the Chinampas' beauty, their bounty was never truly free. It flowed upward to palaces, pyramids, and the endless appetite of empire. As evening falls, the officials paddle away, their canoes sagging with tribute. The farmers remain, repairing banks, tending seedlings, preparing to start again tomorrow. You feel the weight of their resilience. Even under levy and watchful eyes, the gardens continue to feed, to bloom, to endure. The tribute canoes fade into the distance, but the Chinampas are far from empty. You drift past a plot that smells less like maize and more like chocolate. At first, you blink, wondering if your imagination has run away with you. But no, the farmer here is tending cacao beans, a rare luxury in the highland climate. Most cacao came from the warmer lowlands, carried in long-distance trade, but a few Chinampas experimented with coaxing the trees to grow near the lakes. Their success was limited, yet the attempt alone feels ambitious, like trying to grow pineapples in your backyard just to impress the neighbors. One mainstream fact: cacao was prized above nearly everything else. The beans themselves served as currency. and the frothy drink made from them was considered fit for nobles, warriors, and priests. Common farmers rarely sipped it, though they grew the maize and vanilla that flavored it. The quirky tidbit, some Chinampa farmers secretly tucked away a few cacao beans, not to plant, but to hoard as emergency money. A handful of beans could buy a turkey egg or a tamale in the marketplace. You imagine a farmer fumbling nervously in his pouch, counting out beans like coins, hoping none had gone moldy in the meantime. Historians still argue whether cacao cultivation around the lakes was sustainable or mostly symbolic. Some claim the cooler, wetter climate doomed large-scale production. Others argue that with careful care, small groves could survive. Either way, the Chinampas more often grew the supporting cast, tomatoes, chilies, and amaranth, than the starring role of cacao itself. You lean over the side of your canoe and watch women grinding amaranth seeds on stone metates, their rhythmic motions turning grain into fine flour. Amaranth was almost as important as maize in certain festivals, shaped into sacred figurines before being eaten. Its nutty aroma drifts towards you, carried by the breeze. Nearby, tomato vines sprawl over trellises, their fruit glowing red like drops of sunset. A child plucks a chili pepper, holds it up triumphantly, then drops it when the juice burns his fingers. He howls and his mother laughs, shaking her head. Even luxuries have their hazards. You smile, realizing that life on the Chinampas was flavored not only with sustenance but also with indulgence. Chocolate for the elite, amaranth for ritual, chilies for everyone. The canoe rocks gently, and you close your eyes. In the distance, Tenochtitlan's temples loom, but here, the quiet work of cultivating hidden luxuries continues. The Chinampas don't just feed bellies, they feed cravings, ceremonies, and the tiny human joys of sweetness, spice, and comfort. The lake is calm today, yet the air carries a different weight, one of unease, that you paddle slowly, watching farmers glance toward the horizon as if measuring more than weather. The floating gardens, so steady and productive, are also vulnerable, and you feel that tension as the empire's warriors march in the distance. One mainstream fact, the Chinampas supported the Aztec military machine by providing the surplus food needed to sustain armies. Without endless tortillas, chili, and beans, campaigns across Mesoamerica would have faltered quickly. The floating fields were as much a weapon as obsidian blades. A quirky tidbit lightens the moment. Some stories suggest soldiers joked about bringing baskets of squash on campaign because the vines would sprout if tossed on damp ground. Portable gardens, in a sense. You imagine a warrior pausing mid-march, setting down his obsidian spear, and checking whether his squash vines needed watering. Not quite the image of a fearsome conqueror. Historians still argue whether the Chinampas made the empire more resilient to war or more exposed. On one hand, the surplus they produced allowed the Aztecs to feed troops and withstand sieges. On the other, the system was geographically concentrated. Destroy the Chinampas or block the canals, and the empire's food artery could choke. The debate remains muddy, like the canals themselves. You picture warriors returning from campaign, weary but triumphant, stepping into canoes, laden not with gold, but with sacks of maize taken as tribute. Farmers watch them with quiet pride, knowing their floating fields fueled victories far away. Yet the same farmers must have worried, what if war ever came here? What if the Chinampas themselves became a battlefield? A boy, practicing with the wooden spear on the edge of a plot, thrusts dramatically at an invisible foe, then collapses laughing into the mud. His mother scolds him, but her smile betrays pride. Even here, amid beans and squash, the rhythms of war seep into daily life. As the evening breeze ruffles the willows, you sense the duality. The Chinampas embody peace, growth, and fertility, yet they also underpin conquest, tribute, and conflict. They are both shield and target, strength and weakness. And tonight, as you glide along the canals, you can almost hear the quiet question beneath the splash of your paddle. What happens to an empire when its gardens become battlegrounds? The air shifts. Canoes slice through the canals, carrying men in strange armor, their helmets glinting in the sun. You blink, wondering if your eyes deceive you. These are not farmers. These are Spaniards, bewildered conquistadors seeing Chinampas for the first time. They murmur among themselves, pointing with gauntleted fingers, their voices echoing disbelief. One mainstream fact, when Hernán Cortés and his men entered the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were astonished by the sight of Tenochtitlan rising out of the lake, ringed by floating gardens. Bernal Diaz del Castillo later wrote that they thought they were dreaming, unable to believe such a vast city could exist on water. The quirky tidbit: at first, the Spaniards mistook the Chinampas for natural islands. They were so regular, so neatly lined, that the idea of artificial land didn't even cross their minds. Imagine their surprise when they learned these rectangles were built by human hands, not divine intervention. One Spaniard supposedly muttered that it felt like walking in a garden built by enchantment. Historians still argue whether the conquistadors truly grasped the complexity of the Chinampa system at the time. Some accounts suggest they recognized its agricultural genius immediately. Others hint they dismissed it as quaint compared to their plowed fields back in Spain. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, admiration mixed with arrogance. You imagine their confusion at the sheer abundance. Canoes, stacked with chilies, beans, and flowers, glided past them while their own supplies dwindled. To soldiers used to struggling with logistics in foreign lands, the Chinampas must have seemed like endless buffets floating beneath their feet. A farmer nearby continues to weed his maize, ignoring the armored strangers gawking at his livelihood. The Spaniards whisper, cross themselves, and point at the willows anchoring each corner. One even stoops to touch the soil, half expecting it to dissolve in his hand. But it doesn't. It's solid, centuries old, more reliable than the conquest unfolding around it. The sun dips lower, gilding the canals. You can almost hear the mix of awe and unease in the Spaniards' voices. This city, this empire, this garden world, so unlike anything they had seen, must have felt both wondrous and threatening. And so the floating gardens, once a quiet rhythm of maize and mud, now become a stage for collision, old world meeting new, with consequences neither side can fully imagine. The canals no longer hum with peaceful paddles. Instead, they churn with chaos. Smoke curls above the city as war presses in. You grip the edge of your canoe, heart heavy, watching the siege of Tenochtitlan unfold. The once orderly Chinampas, so green and fertile, now lie scarred by fire and blade. One mainstream fact: during the Spanish siege of 1521, the Chinampas became both battleground and casualty. Conquistadors and their allies blocked canals, burned crops, and tore apart the delicate infrastructure that had sustained the city for centuries. The floating gardens, once the empire's lifeline, were ripped open like wounds. The quirky tidbit: some records suggest desperate citizens tore up parts of Chinampas to eat the mud itself, scraping for roots, reeds, or half-grown maize. Imagine being so hungry you chew soil that yesterday cradled your crops. It's a bleak reminder of how fragile abundance can be when war arrives. Historians still argue whether the Spaniards deliberately targeted Chinampas as part of their siege strategy or if the destruction was collateral damage. Some chronicles describe calculated efforts to starve the city by cutting off food. Others imply the devastation came in the fury of battle, with no grand plan beyond survival. Either way, the result was the same. The gardens that once fed hundreds of thousands shrank into silence. You drift past a half-burned plot, smoke rising from its edges. A farmer, his face streaked with ash, tries to salvage seedlings, pressing them into soil that still smolders. The water reflects the flames, making the canal look like a river of fire. In the distance, shouting echoes, Spanish muskets cracking, Aztec war cries rising. Canoes meant for maize now carry warriors. The canals that once mirrored stars now fill with blood and debris. You close your eyes, wishing for the earlier days of laughter and chilly sneezing ducks, but those memories feel fragile against the roar of conquest. As night falls, the smoke thickens, blotting out the moon. You lie back in your canoe, the once soothing lapping of water now replaced by the hiss of fire consuming reed and wood. You realize with a sinking heart that the delicate balance of mud, water, and willows, centuries in the making, is unraveling in mere weeks. The Chinampas, once the empire's pride, now float in ruins, caught in the storm of history's turning tide. The smoke clears slowly, but the scars remain. The once bustling canals of Lake Texcoco are quieter now, their surfaces broken not by fleets of produce canoes, but by scattered rafts and drifting debris. You glide past Chinampas that look weary, edges eroded, willows charred, yet here and there a stubborn farmer bends low over the soil, coaxing life back into the wounded ground. One mainstream fact: after the conquest, many Chinampas did survive, though on a smaller scale. Spanish colonists quickly recognized their productivity and continued to use them, often forcing the surviving indigenous people to tend them under tribute obligations. Maize and beans still sprouted, though the rhythm of empire had changed. The quirky tidbit: some Spanish friars wrote admiringly of Chinampas as gardens of Eden, praising their beauty, but simultaneously condemning the rituals once tied to them. A few even set up kitchen gardens of their own on Chinampas, though their harvests went less to markets and more to monasteries. Imagine a friar earnestly preaching humility while proudly showing off his bumper crop of chilies. Historians still argue whether Chinampas thrived during the early colonial period or slowly dwindled. Some evidence shows continued abundance, with crops feeding Mexico City well into the 17th century. Other records paint a picture of decline, canals silting up as new rulers neglected maintenance. The debate remains unresolved, like the lake's surface, part clear, part clouded. You rest your paddle against the canoe's side and watch a family at work. A man repairs a reed fence, a woman scatters beans into damp furrows, and a child carries water in a clay pot almost as big as himself. Life feels quieter, stripped of grand imperial pomp, but still steady. These people no longer feed a vast empire. They feed their household, their parish, their market stall. The lake, too, has shifted. Spanish engineers drain portions of it, building new causeways and neighborhoods, reshaping the valley into land rather than water. The Chinampas shrink, their quilt of green patches pulled tighter together, yet the knowledge lingers, held in calloused hands and passed down in whispered instruction: where to dredge, how to plant, when to trust the rains. As you glide past, you sense a strange resilience. Though conquest has torn down temples and silenced priests, the floating gardens persist, less grand perhaps, but still alive. The soil remembers, the willows still root, and the people, battered yet enduring, continue to coax maize from the mud, finding sustenance in survival. The years roll into decades, and the decades into centuries. You drift through the canals again, but something feels different, quieter, almost forgotten. Where once the Chinampas stretched like a vast quilt across the lake, now many lie abandoned, edges crumbling, canals clogged with reeds. You see willows still standing, their roots gripping stubbornly, but the laughter of children and the rhythm of paddles are fainter now. One mainstream fact: by the late colonial period, much of Lake Texcoco had been drained. Spanish authorities, seeking more land for settlement and fearful of flooding, diverted water into dikes and channels. The grand expanse of water shrank, and with it, the great Chinampa system that had once dazzled the world. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, old men told children that the abandoned Chinampas were haunted. They said the water still whispered with the voices of ancestors, and that if you walked alone at dusk, you might see phantom canoes gliding silently, never arriving anywhere. It was part cautionary tale, part folklore, perhaps a way to explain the eerie silence of canals once alive with trade. Historians still argue whether the decline of Chinampas was due mostly to colonial neglect, environmental change, or cultural shifts. Some point to the Spanish obsession with draining the lake as the main culprit. Others argue urban growth simply swallowed the land, burying canals under houses and streets. The debate continues, but the result is plain. The grand network of floating gardens receded piece by piece. You paddle past a plot where reeds choke the edges and maize no longer grows. A single fisherman casts a net, his canoe rocking gently, but around him the water is still, heavy. You imagine him remembering his grandfather's stories of busy days, of bustling markets, of mornings filled with flowers and tamales. His net comes up light, but he shrugs, used to disappointment. On another Chinampa, a woman tends a small patch of beans. She works quietly, as though invisible, her plot hemmed in by encroaching weeds. She's not feeding an empire or even a marketplace, just her family. Yet, in her steady movements, you glimpse the same knowledge that once sustained a city of 200,000 souls. The canals feel like ghosts of themselves, shadows of an older rhythm. You close your eyes and hear echoes, canoes creaking, owls calling, ducks sneezing from chili powder. The memories ripple like the water, fading but never gone entirely. Centuries later, you return to the Valley of Mexico, and the scene is startling. The sprawling metropolis of Mexico City has risen over much of the drained lake, its streets buzzing with cars instead of canoes. Yet if you travel southward, beyond the roar of traffic and concrete, you find something unexpected. Chinampas still alive, breathing quietly in the wetlands of Xochimilco. One mainstream fact: modern scholars and farmers have worked to revive Chinampa agriculture in Xochimilco, the last major remnant of the ancient system. Today, it's recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, both for its cultural significance and for the fragile ecosystem it shelters. The quirky tidbit, some Chinamperos, farmers who still work these plots, have teamed up with urban chefs. Imagine ordering tacos in a high-end Mexico City restaurant and discovering the herbs came from a plot tended with the same methods as 500 years ago, farm to table, but with centuries of continuity folded in. Historians still argue whether today's chinampas are faithful continuations of Aztec practice or modern reinventions. Some insist the methods, dredging canal muck, weaving reed banks, planting willows, remain essentially unchanged. Others point to mechanization, fertilizers, and tourism boats as evidence that what survives is more adaptation than preservation. Both views carry weight, like the double currents of a canal. You paddle a brightly painted trajinera, a tourist boat gliding through the canals of Xochimilco. Families laugh, mariachi bands play, and vendors sell roasted corn from canoe to canoe. Beneath the festivities, however, Chinamperos quietly tend their crops. Rows of lettuce, spinach, and herbs gleam green under the sun. The productivity remains astonishing. Small plots still yield several harvests a year, feeding the city in their quiet way. You pause beside a farmer dredging black muck from the canal, just as his ancestors did. He lifts it in a wooden scoop, spreads it across the soil, and wipes his brow with the back of his hand. A willow shades him, its roots clutching the bank like centuries-old fingers. You smile, recognizing the same rhythm you saw in Aztec times: mud, water, seed, and patience. The city looms nearby, restless and modern, but here the water still whispers. You realize the chinampas aren't relics, they're survivors, fragments of an ancient quilt still patched into the fabric of Mexico's future. The canoe glides onward, but now your mind stretches further, beyond Xochimilco, beyond Mexico, into the wider world. You begin to notice how echoes of the Chinampa system appear in places far removed from the Valley of Mexico. Farmers on distant continents, often without knowing it, repeat the same logic. Soil layered with organic matter, crops rotating in harmony, canals doubling as lifelines. One mainstream fact: modern urban farming borrows heavily, sometimes unknowingly, from principles first perfected on the Chinampas. Raised beds, companion planting, nutrient recycling, and water-based cultivation, these aren't cutting-edge inventions, but echoes of a system centuries old. Hydroponics and aquaponics, the pride of futuristic agriculture, are distant cousins of maize sprouting in lake mud. Here's the quirky tidbit: in some cities, floating gardens have literally reappeared. In Bangladesh, farmers weave rafts of water hyacinths and pile soil on top to plant vegetables during monsoon floods. The result? A system almost identical to Chinampas, born independently on the other side of the globe. Somewhere, an Aztec farmer and a Bangladeshi farmer could nod at each other across centuries and say, "Yep, mud on water works." Historians still argue whether Chinampas represent the single most productive pre-industrial farming method in the world. Some crown them the gold standard, others point to rice paddies of East Asia or the terraced slopes of the Andes. The debate isn't just academic, it's about what ancient ingenuity can teach us about feeding billions today. You walk now through a rooftop garden in a bustling modern city. Rows of leafy greens shimmer under sprinklers, while solar panels glint nearby. Yet as you run your hand through the soil, you remember the damp black muck of Lake Texcoco, the willows swaying, the herons watching. The spirit is the same, turning overlooked spaces into abundance, weaving food into the very texture of a city. You lean against the railing, imagining farmers of the past peering over your shoulder. Would they be surprised? Or simply amused? Perhaps they'd just shrug and say, "Of course cities need gardens. How else do you keep them alive?" The wisdom is quiet but enduring, drifting across time like a canoe across calm water. Night falls once more, and you find yourself back where the journey began, drifting through moonlit canals. The willows bow gently, their branches brushing the water. Fireflies blink like wandering stars, and the surface of the lake glows silver, a mirror for the sky. The Chinampas lie quiet now, their rows of maize dark and still, the day's labor folded into rest. One mainstream fact: even after centuries of change, the floating gardens still remind us of the genius of ancient people. They weren't just farms, they were living machines of ecology, balancing soil, water, crops, and community. Few agricultural systems in history have endured so long or inspired so many imitations. The quirky tidbit: Some modern visitors swear they can still hear faint echoes at night, paddles dipping, children laughing, owls calling over the fields. Whether it's imagination or the sound of distant boats, the canals seem to carry memory like water carries moonlight. Ghosts or not, the feeling is undeniable. The gardens hum with the past. Historians still argue whether chinampas should be remembered mainly as relics of empire or as timeless lessons for sustainability. Are they monuments to Aztec power or blueprints for a future where cities must feed themselves again? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's why they continue to capture imagination. Your canoe glides to a stop. You lie back, the night breeze brushing your face, and let the water rock you gently. The stars above seem stitched into the same quilt as the chinampas below. You remember the farmer's laughter, the flowers glowing in baskets, the ducks sneezing at chili powder. You remember the Spaniards staring in disbelief, the markets roaring with trade, the rituals scattering petals into the canals. And then you breathe slower, softer, the edges blur, the chinampas fade into dreams. You let yourself drift, carried by the quiet paddles of memory, into sleep. Now, let your thoughts loosen like reeds swaying gently in the current. The water is calm, the moon steady, and your breath falls into rhythm with the lake. Each exhale is a ripple spreading outward, each inhale a return to stillness. The gardens float silently around you, not as burdens of history, but as soft shapes glowing under the stars. You imagine the farmers long gone, their canoes moored, their tools resting. The soil is quiet, seeds nestled beneath the surface waiting for dawn. Even the owls are hushed now, their calls softened into the distance. Nothing asks anything of you here. There's only still water, silver light, and the comfort of knowing that life has always found a way to grow, even in the humblest patches of mud. Your body feels light, as though you too are drifting. The edges of the chinampas blur, becoming clouds, becoming dreams. The willows lean over you, protective, their branches weaving a gentle lullaby with the breeze. You are safe, suspended between water and sky. As your eyelids grow heavier, imagine yourself rocking slowly in the canoe. The world narrows to the sound of water lapping against wood, to the softness of night pressing close. The gardens fade, the city disappears, and you are left with only the quiet hum of sleep approaching. Drift now with no hurry, no burden. Drift as the chinampas once did, carrying generations through centuries. The lake holds you, patient and endless. You are safe, you are home, you are asleep.